Welcome to Generative AI. Anthony, normally I start by reading a fun fact, but I think in this case you might have some input about the fun fact. So what I read last week was that the Dutch news magazine The Green Amsterdammer researched at the start of June what percentage of books on the internet is written by AI. So they trained a classifier to indicate whether a book is AI generated. And they looked at the Dutch book website bol.com and they tested 323,000 titles. And their classifier basically found 6,600 books which were AI generated. So that's 2% of the books which this bookstore sold. And when they looked at the growth of AI generated books, it went from about 0.1% before the introduction of ChatGPT to 4.2% in April 2024.
Wow.
Yeah. And these books often did not get a rating higher than 2 stars.
Well, how do you think the actual person who wrote a book that only got 1 or 0 stars feels about that?
No, that's a good point. I didn't realize that there are probably authors which have an even worse rating. The extra fun fact I have for you is that Amazon now has a publishing limit of 3 books per day per author.
Okay. Danielle Steele, hardest hit.
But that's still an insanely high limit, right? Who in the world can write manually 3 books per day?
That'd be pretty short.
Yeah, I think so too.
I will say there are some InfoQ editors who produce so much news that it astonishes me.
Yeah, that's also true. It is very interesting to see how much you can produce in a day if you want to. I did also find a case, by the way, on Reddit where an author, instead of shipping the generated book, they actually shipped a book with the ChatGPT prompt in it. So one Redditor received the generation prompt for a book to create crochet patterns, I believe.
Maybe they sell this book at IKEA.
Yeah, that's a good point. They have all the do-it-yourself books.
That is a fun fact, though. It's also, I don't know if that's surprising how high it is or surprising how low it is.
Yeah, true. All right, welcome to Generally AI, an InfoQ podcast. It is season 2, episode number 1. And in this podcast, I, Roland Meertens, will be diving deep with Anthony Elford into the world of AI creativity.
I cannot wait.
I'm excited about this. Shall I start with my topic?
Please, please.
So the thing I wanted to do for this episode is that in terms of creativity, we talked about AI-generated music in episode 2 of the first season. And that is when you showed me Meta's music gen model.
Right.
And what I find interesting is that since that episode, generated music got insanely better.
I think we should take credit for that, at least partially.
Thanks to this episode. But did you play around with Suno?
I have not, but several people have come up to me and they've showed me the songs that they've created with it.
Yeah, I must say these are insanely good. So you can generate song. The song I like the best is the cat song. Let me see if I can play that for you. Drop the bass. It is good, right?
Got a good beat, easy to dance to. What's the name of this song?
Cats. But I also, just coming back to the fun fact we had at the start, I discovered that this person is basically releasing multiple albums a day on Spotify with only cat-themed music or generated with his tool.
Let's see when Spotify imposes a limit.
Yeah, like only 3 albums a day. But I must say that what I also tried is that I tried using Suno as a dedicated music player. So replacing my normal streaming music with Suno generated music. And it is quite doable. It's quite fun. But after about half an hour of listening, your mind kind of dumps down because every song is super catchy, super poppy. And it clearly knows how to follow a recipe and then doesn't deviate from it, where normal human artists do, and that makes it interesting.
So it's really cool for the first time, but maybe after a while you want some variety?
Yeah, the variety seems to be important for my human brain. But I can easily see how you can fill a radio station or fill time on a radio station with this music. But what I wanted to do in this episode was explore more how an artist can really use AI to enhance their creativity. So rather than replacing the creativity, which Suno basically kills for me because it is too easy to get something which sounds good, I wanted to explore how AI can enhance your creativity. And one place where I found that was at Google I/O. Did you look at Google I/O?
I haven't yet. I think there was some news on InfoQ about it, but I haven't read it all yet.
Yeah, so at Google I/O, they presented this thing called Music AI, and they gave a demo. An artist which I really like is Marc Rabier. He did a demo of this tool, and he showed that you can have prompts and you can mix different styles and instruments live. For me, it felt like the actual tool was too easy. But he also showed how he got it mixing into his own loops.
Okay.
Although he uploaded one of those things online and then commented under it, like, I know it's a weird upload, don't hate me, it's just part of a partnership. So it seems that he's not very, very satisfied with it.
You know, I feel like that's our end game. Like a nice end game is where we can get cooperation between people and machines.
Yeah, indeed. And that's what I try to explore for this episode. The main thing which I wanted to discuss with you is an AI-based sample generator. As you might know, sampling is a big thing which artists like Daft Punk popularized. So people, instead of playing an actual instrument, they find the correct sound in another song, in a record, and then they play and remix that. And I thought if you can just create those samples, AI-generated samples, you have like an infinite amount of possibilities of your own creativity. And the tools I looked at, number one was the AI sample generator on aisamplegenerator.com, where if you go to it, you can select what style you want something in, like some percussions, some bongo, some melody, some ambience, and then it will create this sample for you. And this is using AudioGen, so the brother of Meta's MusicGen, which we talked about last time. And this gives you a short sample of 2 to 4 seconds. And what I figured you could do is take these samples and put them into a sampling machine to create some drum beats.
Okay.
So I've been playing around with this. I will let you hear some of the samples. So this is the piano.
Okay.
This is a funky melody. That was the percussion woodblock.
Okay.
This is the metal rod strings.
Interesting.
Interesting is the right word. So it's using AudioGen, and I must say that for me, it felt like it's really hard to get good sounding sounds. But still, you know, someone in the marketing video from Google Music AI, someone compares it to digging in an infinite amount of vinyl crates. So what I tried to do is take one of those tools you can use to create samples and turn it a bit into songs.
Okay.
In this case, I got a Teenage Engineering PO Knockout 2. So I tried to play with these samples, and I must say I tried my best for multiple days, and this is the best I could come up with.
Let's hear it.
Well, I must say I'm ashamed of it. Here we go. You hear the bongos? Okay, Okay, let's stop it there.
Okay.
What did you think of it?
What genre would you call that?
The genre called I really can't do anything with how terrible these genres are. These samples are.
There is a genre called lo-fi. Maybe, I don't know if that quite fits, but some people like that aesthetic of sort of a do-it-yourself. But it was catchy.
Yeah, so I also tried to make more lo-fi style music. But what I mostly noticed with this sample tool is that it's really hard to get good sounding sounds.
Okay.
Sometimes the sound wave starts too early, sometimes too late. Like the buildup isn't really good. So you have to cut a lot to extract the small useful things from the samples. And also AudioGen seemed a bit too eager to produce a lot of noise. So I don't know, like if you would create a quacking duck, the duck would immediately like quack a lot instead of just producing a nice single quack.
And I remember when we did the episode last season, a lot of the generated sounds sounded really kind of noisy.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that has to do with whatever decoding. A lot of times if they're doing something like a transformer, they're outputting a sequence of tokens.
Yeah.
Those tokens have to be decoded into audio waveforms. So possibly there's some quantization noise or something. I'm just speculating.
Yeah, and the other thing which I personally didn't like is that a collaboration with a computer isn't really possible. So I can't take a sample and say something like, oh, I want this bass, but a bit longer and a bit darker or something, and get a response.
Okay.
So I would just generate a lot of samples and then pick the best ones. But this was kind of the best I could find.
That's interesting because that kind of thing is something that a lot of the generative AI can do when it has a text input, is do that again, but change this adjective, more this, more that.
Yeah, and that isn't really there for music yet. I also noticed that once I started shifting the pitch, basically the pluck of the guitar and like a play of the piano sounded absolutely the same. So I tried to create a song with some piano and some guitar, but I shifted the pitch and it was just the same sound.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I figured that once you're able to do this, it can be a valuable resource for musicians when they can actually use AI to enhance their own creativity. I must also say that I found it kind of hard to find something where you can jam with a computer. I see some value in that maybe I can play my instrument for a few bars, or like you play the bass, right? So maybe you could play a catchy bass loop and then say, I want to keep playing this, but can you generate a drum beat under it? And then maybe some strings over it, or maybe some violin, like find a violin sound which blends into the background. That also doesn't really exist. That's something which I think could be a nice add.
Yeah, I can very well see that being extremely useful for me as a bass player, because nobody wants to hear just bass.
Yeah.
It's not that entertaining without something like drums and maybe a guitar as well.
Yeah, if you can get it small enough, you could fit it into one of those effect pedals that you take an effect pedal, it automatically detects your bar length and then starts jamming with you. Maybe a project for another time.
But, that goes back to my dream scenario of the machines being there and working with us, working as tools.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, then that's, as I said, that's what I try to explore. The other thing, if people want to explore this world, the other thing you can use is a tool called SampLab on samplab.com/text-to-sample. You can either use this as a standalone tool to create samples from text, but you can also have it as a plugin in Ableton. And I by no means know how much easier that makes it or how much harder, but at least you can drag the samples into your virtual drum kits. And it is text to sample, but it runs locally. So it at least runs on your MacBook. And this also uses the music gen model in the background. So it downloads that as the first thing it does.
Remind me, or do you know the license on the music gen? Is that why we're seeing it pop up in these tools? Is the license one of those more permissive ones?
Yeah, I think so. And also this is where I do see a value in these tools that I don't know anything about licensing in the music industry, but I can imagine that if you take actual samples from songs, you have to clear those samples with the artists. And I don't know if that's 1 note or 1 second. Like, how long do you have to sample before it becomes copyright infringement?
I'm not sure. That's now we're talking about the intricacies of case law. and all kinds of good stuff.
But I feel like this is a legal area you don't want to risk getting into, and then AI-generated samples can really help you.
That's a good point, yeah.
Especially if you're a band like Justice, who just built up an entire album over samples and like single notes and tiny pieces of music.
Are you a Beastie Boys fan?
I'm hearing that I should listen more to the Beastie Boys. Why?
Well, the reason I said that is that their albums are just chock full of samples, and maybe sometimes not actual samples, but recreations of snippets of songs.
Yeah.
Paul's Boutique, their second album, is just it's all samples.
Interesting. As I said, I'm trying to get better at it, and if I have actual samples, it seems to be easier than the AI generated samples. You want to listen to my my beat one last time?
You know it.
There we go. Yeah, the bongos are really killing it.
When is the next Eurovision? I think you might have a winner on your hands here.
I don't know if the Netherlands is willing to send another candidate from the Netherlands. After what happened this year at the Eurovision, the Dutch candidate got disqualified. I still don't know why. I don't think that the Netherlands wants to participate anymore.
Oh, are they done?
I don't know what's up. Hey folks, have you ever wondered how software leaders pushing the boundaries in today's environment are adopting emerging trends? At QCon San Francisco, November 18 to 22, you will step inside the minds of the engineers who will share how they implement innovations in real-world scenarios. Explore tracks like architectures you've always wondered about, engineering productivity, and, my favorite, generative AI in production and advancements. Here you can learn from practicing senior software developers on how they are adopting emerging trends. Find out more about the conference at QConSF.com. We hope to see you there.
All right, so we're talking a little bit about generative AI, and my angle this episode is, how good is the generative AI? How do you measure how good generative AI is? So with more traditional machine learning, things like discriminative or predictive AI, like classifiers, regression models, we know how to measure how good those are. Typically, there's some test data set, which is an input to your model, but you also have the expected output that we call ground truth. So given an input, we know what the model should output. And you can compare what you actually get to that ground truth that you know you should get. And then you calculate an error metric. Yeah. So with classifiers, you have things like confusion matrices, you have precision, recall, F1. These are all, measuring the relationship among true positive, true negative, false negative. With generative AI, what is ground truth? What's the ground truth for, I want a picture of an astronaut riding a horse? Or what is ground truth for, I want a funky beat?
And how do you measure? Yeah, how do you know how creative or how good this is?
Yeah, let me just ask you, how would you do it if I charged you with the task of evaluating generative AI model?
Well, the problem is that you can try to see if you can at least nudge it towards something which exists, and then try to see if you can do that.
Yeah, that's definitely, and I don't want to spoil it, but yes, that is one way to do it.
Is there some kind of deeper feature space you can compare it to?
Pretty much, yeah. So we'll get into that, in fact. Now with code generation, I think it's pretty easy, right? When I'm evaluating code that I write, there's one simple test. It compiles.
Yeah.
Or it works on my box. Yeah. So
if you're lucky.
And if we want to be really strict, well, it passes all the unit tests. So we won't be talking really about code generation, but I will mainly focus on language models like ChatGPT and text to image generation models like DALL-E or Midjourney. So we'll start with language models. And in the case of language models, there actually are some objective evaluation metrics.
Are these things like the BLEU or something like that?
You are right on. That is one of the things I'm going to talk about. But first, I'm going to talk about what a language model does. A language model, you give it several input tokens or words, and that's the context. And then you ask it to predict the most likely next token. And so the way that these models are trained is you actually do know the next token because you took some text from the internet, chopped off the last word, gave that to the model, and you want the model to predict that last word that you hid from it. So the mechanics of training requires that we calculate a loss function, which measures this, how good it is at predicting the next token. Now, you probably remember several years ago, OpenAI came up with these so-called scaling laws. And all those are equations that predict that loss metric. So given the size of the model, size of the data set, the amount of compute to train the model, you can predict the loss that the model will achieve on a test data set.
Is there a super strong correlation in this case between the loss and the metric they actually care about?
There is. So that's a proxy, but that's a very good point, right? Nobody really cares about loss, right?
Yeah.
When you're using ChatGPT, you don't care about the loss. You want it to do some task like question answering, And in fact, with question answering, you can produce objective metrics because we've been doing this forever for human beings in school. We can give them a test and score their ability to answer questions. So you can do multiple choice or true false, and then it's pretty easy to measure that. In fact, this is a common way that language models are evaluated. There are several benchmarks that are basically just tests, just like students are given. So there's a benchmark called MMLU, which stands for Massive Multitask Language Understanding. And it's got things like elementary mathematics.
I never really liked the fact that they do mathematics in those large language models, but fair enough. It's probably part of it.
Yeah. And of course, different models have different strengths, but there are other things where you see headlines like they give a language model, like I think GPT-4 took the bar exam, the legal exam and passed. But anyway, the website Hugging Face, which is sort of a hub for all things large language model, they have a leaderboard. And you can go and look and see which language model does the best on these benchmarks. This is automated.
Yeah. Who is the best?
I was looking at the open language models, and of course, it's some language model that some random person uploaded to Hugging Face. So someone named David Kim right now has the top ranked model on the open LLM leaderboard.
Congratulations to David. I really like this. You can just create your own massive language model on your own computers.
And you can submit it to the leaderboard and they run the automated tests. Like you said, yeah, that is pretty neat. Now, of course, being good citizens, we wouldn't use a large language model to take our high school exams for us.
Naturally.
But we're going to use it in a more proper way, maybe to write essays or summarize documents. So in this case, the task doesn't really have a bright line ground truth, right? Let's say we want ChatGPT to summarize a long document. Right? So you copy and paste the text of a document and say, please summarize this. The answer that you get could be correct, but how do we compare that against a ground truth?
Or do you get a lot of English teachers to rate your LLM output every day?
Well, maybe you will. But so you mentioned BLEU. I'm trying to say that with an accent because it's not BLUE, it's BLEU.
BLEU.
Which stands for Bilingual Evaluation Understudy. And there's another one called ROUGE, which stands for Recall-Oriented Understudy for Gisting Evaluation. So these are two metrics that can calculate the similarity between two pieces of text. So BLEU was, of course, created for translation checking.
Yeah, that's also what I used it for in the past.
Essentially, both of them compare the overlap of the words in your generated output versus the ground truth. BLEU is more like a precision where it's got the fraction of generated words in the ground truth, and ROUGE has recall in the name. It's the number of matching n-grams between the two texts.
Yeah.
So that's a similarity. So again, that is still kind of an objective metric. There's another way to do similarity, which is to compare the meaning of two different pieces of text.
Yeah, because that's what I didn't like about BLEU, is that you could have exactly the same meaning for translation and still get a massive punishment.
Yeah. So the way you can measure similarity, you can use an encoder language model like BERT. BERT, you put in some text, it will give you a vector representation of the meaning or the semantics of that text. So if you have your generated text from the language model, you put that into BERT, you get a vector that represents the meaning of that text. And you could take the ground truth, do the same thing, put it into BERT, and you get a vector. Now you can see how similar the vectors are. You can use a distance metric like cosine distance.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I once had this idea about, I don't know, like 9 years ago, and then I tried to submit it to some kind of machine learning competition or camp or something, and it got rejected. And I'm now like, so it's actually a good idea.
Yeah, it's called BERTScore. You were ahead of your time. So that's language models. What about text to image generation? So how do you evaluate those? Because again, there's no ground truth for astronaut riding a horse. But you mentioned something. Do you remember what
you maybe it gives you the same feeling, gives you the same vibe?
So there are some automated metrics where you have an existing data set and a metric, just like we had with, ground truth and these BLEU or ROUGE metrics.
Yeah.
So there's a data set for images called COCO. And that came from Microsoft. It has a bunch of images with captions.
Yeah, it's common objects in context, right?
Exactly. So when you do text to image generation, it's kind of like reverse captioning. You give it the caption and say, make an image that matches this caption.
Yes.
So the idea is from the COCO data set, you take the captions and you give those to your image generator, and it generates a bunch of images. And now the ground truth sort of is the images from the COCO data set. So you need a measure of similarity between those images and the generated images. And there's a metric. I'm struggling with these French words. I believe it's called Fréchet, inception distance, or I'm just going to say FID. So
the inception distance.
Right. So the inception comes from, there's a pre-trained image classifier called inception. This is very similar to the idea of using BERT. It's a classifier, but right before that last classification layer, you have a vector that kind of represents that image in some space, which, you said that, I think, earlier.
Yeah, so the embedding should be close to the embedding of a ground truth.
Right. So, but you have to do it on a collection. So you have to do it on a distribution. And the FID compares the stats. When you put your generated images, multiple ones in, you get a distribution of those activations. You do the same with the COCO data set. You get a distribution of the activations that those images create.
Okay. And so the distribution of your generated images should match the distribution of the original images. So it's not about being able to get the exact vector of the original image.
Right. So that's a shortcoming, right? So there's another metric that can be used to measure how close the image content represents the prompt, and that's the CLIPScore. So just like BERT had, the BERTScore for text, you can get a CLIPScore for an image. Now, I know you know all about CLIP because you gave a talk about CLIP.
I want to talk about CLIP all day.
So as you know, CLIP can measure the similarity between an image and the text description of that image, right?
Yeah.
So to get the CLIPScore, you put your prompt into CLIP and you put the generated image into CLIP. And if CLIP says they're similar, then your generated model did a good job.
But they are probably already using CLIP to guide the generation, right? So then you're kind of double dipping with the same model.
That's exactly right. So these metrics are not perfect. For FID, you need a collection of images. CLIP, as you mentioned, has its own shortcomings. Also, supposedly, it's not good at counting, which maybe explains why the generated AI is bad at fingers and hands. Okay. Yeah. So now if I asked you, how would you do it? And you did mention, having a bunch of teachers read the essays that the AI generates. Well,
Yes.
It turns out that is a great way to evaluate generative AI content. You ask a real person, what do they think? I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. That's an old thing.
Yeah. You can put it all in a museum and see what people are actually looking at, and then it's good.
Exactly. Now, someone say, well, that's not objective or scientific. You're asking people for their subjective opinion. So there's a trick you can do with that. And I call it the optometrist trick. Better one, better two. You show the judge the output of two different models and say, which one do you like better? Which one did a better job?
Yeah.
Given this prompt, which one gave you a better output?
Yes.
So this is a head-to-head ranking. And again, maybe you don't get an objective score for your particular model, but you can rank a model against other models. So this is an ELO. Is it ELO or ELO?
I always say ELO.
ELO. So it's like chess ranking, right? You see how one model does against the other, and eventually you can rank them all. And in fact, this is a thing for chatbots. There's a chatbot arena where real people can log in and take a prompt, and it's given to two different models side by side, and you can pick which one you like.
Chatbot arena sounds like a way too exciting name for the fact that people are just ranking different texts.
They had to drive traffic somehow.
Yes.
But a lot of research teams for text to image generation do this. They take their model, they prompt it, they prompt something else like DALL-E, and they give it to a human judge and say which one is better. So you'll see that in research papers when, our model outperforms DALL-E, it's based on that.
Yeah, interesting. I once looked at this because at some point there was the rumor that someone spotted a really good model in the wild, and then people on the internet started talking about what model it could be because the output was so much better when they were ranking it. And to be honest, when I checked it out, this hidden secret model was indeed really good.
Was it actually some guy in a basement drawing pictures? Or?
I don't know. Maybe it was just OpenAI testing a new beta version of a model. Okay. That was what people suspected.
Well, it turns out this idea of ranking model outputs, have a human ranking model outputs, has another application beyond just evaluating the models. And so you've probably heard of RLHF.
Reinforcement learning from human feedback.
Yeah. And that's what OpenAI used to fine-tune GPT-3 to construct GPT. And they did it again with GPT-4. And now everybody's doing this instruct tuning their models. So this is to solve the problem of you get an output from a large language model and you read it and you say, well, this is really amazing and interesting, but it is not at all what I wanted you to do. Yeah. So one example is we know that they'll just make stuff up.
Yeah.
Or it'll, be very long-winded and go on and on and on. And it's just not what you want. So we say that the model's output is not aligned with your intent.
Yeah.
So the solution is this RLHF. And the way that works is you got to create a data set, right? A fine-tuning data set. And the way you collect that is you give a prompt to a language model and it generates several outputs. And then you give it to a human judge and say, rank these. And so now with that fine-tuning data set, you can do some reinforcement learning so that the language model being fine-tuned does a better job generating text that people like.
Yeah. They could also sell books online and see how many stars they get.
That sounds like a great way to reinforcement learning.
If it's less than 2 stars, you get rid of the model.
Reward function is stars. Well, of course, the whole reason we want these models to begin with is we don't want to do this kind of grunt work of things like ranking LLM responses.
Yeah.
So we're going to automate that. We're already kind of doing it with BERTScore, with CLIPScore. Well, BERT's a language model. What if you just gave some generated text to GPT-4 and said, evaluate this? And so researchers are doing this, especially with these smaller language models. They're taking the output of that and having GPT-4 evaluate it.
But it feels like the butcher is evaluating its own meat, which is probably not an English saying.
No, I don't think I've heard that one. But if I may allude to the podcast we did with Michael, it's robots versus robots now. It's robots all the way down. Yeah. And so I will go back to what I said earlier at the beginning of the episode. Where we really want to be, I think, is that the AI is helping us, is doing what we want. And so ultimately, I think the best evaluation is human judges. And, you get an output and you like it. You get a funky beat that you can dance to.
Hopefully. If you're lucky, you get the cat song.
Well, that's all my content, Roland.
I really enjoyed it.
And I enjoyed learning about the cat song.
All right. Shall we do words of wisdom? What did we learn in this podcast? And did you learn anything yourself recently?
I did have a fun fact. I did some prep.
Please tell me.
The BBC had a headline about how are animals conscious? And in there, some researcher claims that bees can count, recognize human faces, and learn how to use tools.
Oh, interesting.
I think bees probably have far fewer neurons than GPT-4, so there's hope.
Until how far can a bee count?
That was not in the article.
Because I can tell you that a crow can count to, I believe it's 7.
Okay. Well, bees have 6 legs, so maybe they can count to 6.
The way that they evaluate to how far a crow can count is that they put up a hut just outside of a crow's nest, and then people walk into it. So the crow stays at a distance. And if you put more than 7 people in, the crow will keep being away. Once you start walking them out, after 7 walk out, the crow apparently lost count and goes back to his nest.
Oh, what a great job that would be.
To test this.
Yes.
Ask a lot of animals to count.
Well, I mean, Clever Hans.
I love Clever Hans.
It's probably the biggest challenge. Was he Dutch, Clever Hans?
No, it's a German horse. Also for listeners who don't know what who Clever Hans is. Clever Hans was a horse which could apparently do a lot of tricks and calculations, but it turned out that the owner, either with knowing it or without knowing it, just made a certain movement as soon as the horse should stop tapping. So the horse was just really good at interpreting its owner.
Which is actually pretty clever. Anyway.
Yeah, but I always tell people that sometimes someone comes to you with the output of a large language model and they say, look at how good it is. And it's just the person interpreting the output in a really interesting way rather than the large language model being right.
I think so. So is that words of wisdom?
Well, I watched the series Masters of the Air, and I learned more about the northern bomb sites. Do you know about that?
Yes, I've heard of it.
I find it so fascinating that in the Second World War, they had a mechanical computer which could control the airplane and mechanically do all the calculations for when to release the bomb to get the correct trajectory to target a certain place.
It's still unclear how effective it was.
I don't know about that, but I do know that they were very secretive about it. So you also see that in the series that as soon as they have to get out of the plane when it's crashing, they first take the northern bomb site to keep it out of enemy hands, to not have them have access to this mechanical computer which can do all these calculations and control an airplane, etc., etc.
That's true. They definitely thought it was a wonder weapon.
Yeah, and otherwise you have to do all the calculations by hand, right? So
right.
I think there you can improve something.
Definitely.
If only they had an arena where they could test these control algorithms. Yeah.
We're getting pretty dark.
Yes.
I thought it funny that the two text similarity metrics are both French words for colors.
Yeah.
BLEU came first. I suspect the person who came up with ROUGE did that on purpose.
Yeah, I think, is there already a large language model which can take the word you want to get as output and then generates what the acronym actually stands for?
I've done that a couple of times with ChatGPT.
How well did it work?
It's as good as, I used it.
Nice, yeah. Thanks so much for listening to the start of our second season. I'm very excited to be back.
Me too.
Yeah, so if you enjoyed this podcast, please tell your friends about it. I think normally people ask you to rate a podcast, but I honestly don't know where you can find this function in the most popular platforms. But if you are listening and you happen to know where to find it, please try and search it, because I think that even for Spotify, you can't rate podcasts on the Mac app. You can only do it on your mobile phone. So telling your friends about it and telling them what podcasts to listen is the most effective way. I would say that you can follow us on loads of media platforms, but as we can see, media platforms are changing so rapidly that I don't know if this is true anymore when this gets recorded or when this gets aired.
I just hope our rating is higher than the ChatGPT generated podcasts.
Yeah, that's also a good question. I don't know if there's already ChatGPT generated podcasts. There probably are. And you can always find us back on infoq.com. There we publish interesting news. So yeah, like and subscribe. Thank you very much for listening. And thank you very much, Anthony.
Thank you. See you next time.
See you next time. The other thing which is interesting, by the way, about the books is that on this Dutch book website, if you search for a biography of Oppenheimer, the search results only contain AI-generated biographies. You don't even find the actual biography anymore.
Wow.
So there's a really good biography of Oppenheimer. I didn't read it.
Prometheus? American Prometheus?
Prometheus, yes.
I read that. Supposedly that's what the movie was based on, or at least was an influence. It was good.
Yeah, but so if you search for the biography of Oppenheimer, you get a lot of books which they only cost $3, $4, $5, something like that. They don't have any ratings here. And the other thing which is interesting is that the people who buy the books and leave the ratings, they don't tend to say this book was AI generated. They just tend to say the writing was very repetitive, didn't go very deep. So the people who buy the books don't even seem to understand the difference between a really good book and a bad book. And they don't distinguish. Like, it passes the Turing test in some way, in that they can't distinguish between bad writing and AI generated. So I suspect that nobody is asking for their money back.
Crazy.
Can you guess what the top categories are for these books?
How to do AI, probably.
No, it's worse.
Oh. Does it rhyme with corn?
No, it's better than that. No, so the most of the books they found were about health and self-help and management and like your body health, personal development, language. There were a set of cookbooks and like computer info like IT books, sports. But can you imagine buying a book about health which is AI generated?
Oh, man.
Yeah, this is not the future I signed up for.